The wind howled through the cracks of the attic window like a restless spirit, rattling the glass and sending a chill down Clara Mae Jenkins' spine. She pulled her shawl tighter around her broad shoulders, the rough wool scratching at her neck. The single candle on her sewing table flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the unfinished wedding dress spread before her, another commission for some blushing bride who would never know the touch of Clara's own calloused fingers on her wedding day. Outside, the Illinois winter had turned the world to iron, freezing the mud ruts of Main Street into jagged scars. Clara's fingers ached as she guided the needle through the delicate lace, her joints stiff from the cold. The boarding house attic was drafty, but it was hers, paid for with every careful stitch, every mended tear, every silent night spent hunched over her work while other women her age whispered behind their hands about the sturdy spinster who took in sewing. A sharp knock at the door startled her. The needle slipped, drawing a bead of blood from her thumb. She sucked at the wound absently as Mrs. Thompson's voice carried through the thin wood. "Mail for you, Miss Jenkins. Special delivery all the way from Wyoming Territory." Clara's heart stuttered. She'd been exchanging letters with Gideon Turner for 3 months now, but the arrival of each new envelope still sent a flutter through her stomach. Setting aside the blood-spotted lace, she wiped her hands on her apron and rose, her hips bumping the table in the cramped space. The envelope in Mrs. Thompson's hand was thick, the paper coarse under Clara's fingertips. She traced the postmark, Dry Creek, Wyoming, in the bold, angular handwriting that had become so familiar. The boarding house mistress lingered, curiosity sharp in her bird-like eyes, but Clara merely nodded her thanks and shut the door firmly. Alone again, she broke the seal with care, unfolding the pages with hands that trembled slightly. The scent of wood smoke and something earthy, sagebrush, perhaps, lifted from the paper. "Dear Miss Jenkins," the letter began, "the winter here has been hard but fair. Lost 3 head of cattle to wolves last week, but the new barn stands strong. I find myself thinking often of your last letter, how you described stitching your mother's quilt while the snow fell. Mary used a quilt. There's a frame in the attic still, *. Clara's breath caught. This was the first time he'd mentioned his late wife by name. She read on, her pulse quickening as Gideon described the way the sunset painted the buttes in fiery hues, how the creek sang under its mantle of ice, the way he hoped, if she was still willing, they might sit together by the fire come spring and plant a garden. Not once did he mention her appearance. Not once did he ask for a photograph or comment on the strong, work-worn hands she described in her letters. He wrote of partnership, of shared labor, of quiet evenings and the hope of children. By the time she reached the postscript, *, if you decide to come, bring your mother's quilt. This house could use some warmth. *, tears blurred Clara's vision. Outside, the wind moaned against the eaves. Inside, something long frozen in Clara's chest began to thaw. She pressed the letter to her lips, then carefully folded it away in the cedar box where she kept her most precious things, her mother's thimble, the dried rose from her father's funeral, and now, this fragile, impossible hope. The candle guttered as Clara took up her pen. The nib scratched across the paper like a promise. *, Dear Mr. Turner, I will arrive on the 15th of February. I will bring the quilt, my shears, and enough courage for both of us, *. Somewhere in the night, a branch snapped under the weight of ice. Clara barely heard it. For the first time in years, she was already looking west. The station platform trembled beneath Clara's boots as the great iron beast hissed and groaned, its massive wheels churning the icy air into steam. Around her, the world was a chaos of farewells, mothers clutching children, merchants barking orders to porters, and a dozen other women like her, their faces a mixture of excitement and terror, all clutching letters from men they had never met. Clara adjusted her grip on the trunk containing her entire life, her mother's quilt carefully folded atop her sewing tools, the lace curtains she had stitched with her own hands now packed away like the ghosts of a future she had once imagined for herself. The weight of it pulled at her arms, but she held firm, her back straight beneath the coarse wool of her traveling dress. She would not show weakness. Not here, not now. A shrill whistle pierced the air. The conductor's voice boomed, * all aboard for Cheyenne, Laramie, and points west. *. Clara's breath fogged in the frigid air as she hesitated, one foot on the boarding step. Behind her, Illinois lay frozen and familiar, the cramped attic room where she had spent a decade sewing other women's dreams into reality, the pitying glances of townsfolk who whispered poor Clara when they thought she couldn't hear. Ahead of her, Wyoming, wild, unknown, and a man who had promised her a home but had never seen her face. A sharp nudge at her back. Asterisk move along, miss. This train ain't got all day. Asterisk. Clara climbed aboard. The compartment was cramped, the wooden bench hard beneath her, but Clara barely noticed. Outside the grimy window, the world began to slide past, first in slow, shuddering jerks, then in a gathering rush of snow-blurred fields and skeletal trees. The rhythm of the wheels settled into her bones, never going back, never going back, never going back. Across from her, a girl no older than 19 fidgeted with the buttons of her gloves. Martha Twiggs, she'd introduced herself earlier, another mail-order bride, though her letters had come from a shopkeeper in Laramie, not a rancher in Dry Creek. "You're brave," Martha said suddenly, her voice barely audible over the train's clamor. Clara blinked. Asterisk brave? Asterisk. Asterisk traveling all that way alone. Asterisk Martha's gaze flickered over Clara's sturdy frame, her work-roughened hands. Asterisk most men out here want little china dolls. You must be certain your fellow won't mind. Asterisk she trailed off, but the unspoken words hung between them, won't mind a woman built like a barn door. Clara's fingers tightened around the letter in her pocket, the last one Gideon had sent, its edges softened from too much handling. He knows what I am, she said, more to herself than to Martha. But doubt slithered in anyway. What if Martha was right? What if Gideon took one look at her, at the width of her hips, the strength in her arms, and turned her away? What then? The train lurched around a bend, and Clara's stomach lurched with it. Night fell. The car grew colder, the oil lamps casting long shadows. Martha slept fitfully, her head lolling against the window, but Clara remained awake, watching the stars whirl past in the vast black sky. Somewhere out there, Gideon Turner was waiting. She imagined him sitting by a fire, his big hands turning a cup of coffee between his palms, wondering about the woman who was hurtling toward him through the dark. Did he picture her as delicate, like his Mary had been? Or did he truly not care, as his letters claimed? Clara pressed her forehead to the icy glass. The reflection staring back at her was sharp-eyed, strong-jawed, a face made for endurance, not beauty. Let him want me as I am, she thought fiercely. Or not at all. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing. The train raced on, carrying her toward a future she could no longer outrun. The train shuddered to a stop with a final, exhausted hiss of steam. Clara pressed her face to the frosted window, her breath fogging the glass as she wiped it clean with her sleeve. Dry Creek Station was little more than a weathered plank platform adrift in a sea of snow. No bustling crowds, no cheerful greetings, just an empty stretch of wind-scoured wood and the skeletal outline of a town beyond. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her trunk as she stepped onto the platform. The cold hit her like a slap, stealing her breath. Snow crunched underfoot, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. He'll be here, she told herself. He'll come. The stationmaster, a grizzled man with a tobacco-stained beard, barely glanced up from his ledger as she passed. A few boys hurled snowballs near the tracks, their laughter sharp in the thin air. A lone rider trotted by, tipping his hat but not stopping. Clara counted the minutes. 10. Then 20. Her toes went numb inside her boots. Then, at last, a figure emerged from the swirling snow, a broad-shouldered man in a heavy brown coat, his hat pulled low against the wind. Gideon. Her heart leapt. But as he drew closer, something in Clara's chest went very still. He didn't smile. Didn't rush forward to take her hands. His eyes, pale as river ice, skimmed over her, then away, as if he'd already seen enough. Asterisk Miss Jenkins. Asterisk his voice was flat. Asterisk Mr. Turner. Asterisk she forced the words past the sudden tightness in her throat. He hefted her trunk onto his wagon without another word. The ride to the ranch passed in silence, the only sound the creak of wheels and the occasional snort of the horses. Clara sat rigid, her unloved hands clenched in her lap. When they passed the small, fence plot with its single wooden cross, Gideon finally spoke. Asterisk Mary's there. Asterisk a pause. Asterisk she was small. Could lift her with one arm. Asterisk. Clara said nothing. The house was sturdy but bleak, its windows dark. Gideon led her inside without ceremony. A single lamp guttered on the table, casting long shadows over the bare walls. No fire in the hearth. No meal waiting. You'll sleep in the back room, he said, setting her trunk down with a thud. Clara's stomach twisted. Not his room, then. She turned to face him, her chin high. Asterisk I'd like to see the kitchen. I can start supper, asterisk. Asterisk not yet. Asterisk. Gideon hesitated, then strode toward the back door. Asterisk come with me. Asterisk. Behind the barn, the wind cut deeper. Gideon stared at the ground, scuffing his boot in the snow. Asterisk you're not what I expected. Asterisk. The words hung between them, brittle as icicles. Clara didn't flinch. Asterisk in what way? Asterisk. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Asterisk you're a good woman, I can tell. But Mary was, asterisk his hands flexed uselessly. Asterisk delicate. Asterisk. A gust of wind tore through the yard, whipping Clara's skirts around her legs. She felt it then, the awful, crushing weight of understanding. Asterisk too big. Too strong. Too much, asterisk. For a wild moment, she wanted to laugh. All those letters, all those promises, and it came down to this? To the width of her hips, the strength in her back? She swallowed the laugh before it could escape. I see, she said, her voice eerily calm. Asterisk then I'll take my trunk and go. Asterisk. Gideon's head snapped up. Asterisk go where? It's near dark. Asterisk. That, Clara said, turning away, asterisk is no longer your concern. Asterisk. She left him standing there, his mouth half open, snow gathering on his shoulders. Back in the house, she hauled her trunk outside herself, her arms burning with the weight of it. Gideon called after her once, but she didn't look back. The road to town was long and dark. Snowflakes caught in her lashes, her breath coming in ragged clouds. Somewhere behind her, a door slammed shut. Clara walked on. Her cheeks were wet. She told herself it was only the cold. The wind howled through Dry Creek's deserted streets like a wounded animal, driving needles of snow into Clara's face. Her fingers had long since lost feeling, fused into stiff claws around the handle of her trunk. The weight of it, of her entire life reduced to a single box, dragged at her arms, but she refused to stop. Stopping meant freezing. And freezing meant Gideon Turner would win. A light flickered ahead. The apothecary's sign swung violently in the storm, its hinges screaming. Clara stumbled toward it, her boots plunging knee-deep into a snowdrift. Through the frost-rimed window, she could make out an old man bent over a ledger, his spectacles catching the lamplight. She crashed through the door in a whirl of snow and desperation. The warmth hit her first, the rich scent of herbs and beeswax, the comforting tang of alcohol. Then the pain as feeling rushed back into her frozen extremities, sharp as 1,000 sewing needles. The old man looked up slowly. We're closed. Clara's voice emerged raw. I need work. His eyes, sharp as a scalpel, traveled from her wind-burned face to the trunk at her feet. You're the Turner boys' mail-order bride. Not anymore. She held out her hands, palms up. The calluses stood out like ridges in the lamplight. I can sew. I can cook. I know every medicinal herb from feverfew to yarrow. Something flickered in his expression. He removed his spectacles and polished them deliberately. Can you stitch a wound? Better than your nurse. A snort. Don't have one. He jerked his chin toward the back room. Cot's yours if you can mix a decent poultice. Payments roof and board, plus 2 bits a week for mending. Clara didn't hesitate. Done. The attic room above the apothecary was little more than a closet with a cot, but it was clean. Clara collapsed onto the thin mattress, her body one great ache. Outside, The storm raged on, rattling the single window like a living thing trying to get in. She dreamed of sewing machines that night, great, clattering beasts that chased her through endless corridors while faceless women whispered too big, too strong, too much. Morning brought Clarity and Tommy Henderson. The boy appeared like a specter at Clara's bedside, his thin legs dangling uselessly over the edge of a wheeled chair Doc Henderson had cobbled together from barrel staves and old wagon parts. "Ma says you got left at the altar," he announced, his voice carrying the brutal honesty of childhood. Clara sat up slowly. "Your ma talks too much." Tommy grinned, revealing a missing front tooth. "Doc says you're gonna fix my legs." Clara's protest died on her lips as she took in the homemade braces strapped to the boy's withered limbs, the hopeful gleam in his eyes. Doc Henderson's voice floated up the stairs. "I said she might help design better supports, you little eavesdropper." Clara studied the braces, the crude leather straps already chafing the boy's pale skin. An idea took shape. "You like to run, Tommy?" His face fell. "Can't." She reached for her sewing kit. "Let's see about that." Word spread fast in Dry Creek. By week's end, miners began appearing at the apothecary, not for Doc's tonics, but for the stitch which could close a wound so neat it barely scarred. Women came next, whispering about female troubles over Clara's yarrow tea. Then the children, always the children, drawn by the woman who didn't flinch at their dirt-caked hands, who mended their torn trousers while telling stories of queens who wielded swords instead of needles. One evening, as Clara packed a poultice for old Mrs. Lundgren's rheumatism, Doc Henderson cleared his throat. "Turner was by today." The mortar slipped in Clara's hands. "Asked after you." The old man polished his spectacles with exaggerated care. Seemed regretful. Clara ground the herbs harder. "Some things can't be mended, document." Outside, the first snowdrops pushed through the frozen earth. The mercantile bell jingled like a Sunday church summons as Clara pushed through the door, shaking snow from her shawl. She'd come for more yarrow root. Doc Henderson's supply had run dry after the influenza outbreak, but the moment she crossed the threshold, the scent of leather-bound pages and cinnamon stopped her dead. Eli Cartwright stood behind the counter, his nose buried in a book so thoroughly devoured its spine had split. Sunlight through the front window caught the dust motes swirling around his bent head, gilding the silver strands at his temples. He didn't look up, not even when Clara's boots thudded against the wooden floorboards. "Miss Jenkins." His voice was deeper than she remembered from their brief encounters at church socials. "Come to rescue us from another medical emergency?" Clara's cheeks warmed. The last time she'd been here, she'd commandeered Eli's entire stock of clean rags to staunch the blacksmith's bleeding arm. "Only if you consider Mrs. Peterson's sourdough starter an emergency." That made him look up. His eyes weren't the flat river ice gray of Gideon's, but a rich, warm brown, the color of good whiskey held up to sunlight. They crinkled at the corners as he snapped the book shut. "Ah." The starter that took over Lundgren's root cellar. Like a biblical plague, Clara agreed, stepping closer. Her gaze dropped to the book in his hands. "David Copperfield?" Eli's thumb brushed the embossed cover almost reverently. "You know Dickens?" "I know enough to say Pip's a fool for chasing Estella when Biddy's right there." The words tumbled out before she could stop them, a fragment of the girl who'd once stolen hours in her father's study, reading by candlelight after the sewing was done. Something shifted in Eli's expression. Without a word, he bent beneath the counter and emerged with a volume whose green cover had been mended with careful strips of linen. "Then you'll appreciate this." Jane Eyre stared up at her in faded gilt letters. Clara's breath caught. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, the spine creaking open to reveal margins crammed with pencil notes, not corrections, but conversations, as if Eli had been arguing with the text itself. "She reminds me of someone," he said softly. The bell jangled again as a group of miners entered, shattering the moment. Clara snapped the book shut, but Eli merely nodded toward the back room. "Take it. The yarrow's in the storeroom, help yourself." Clara returned the next week with the book and a loaf of molasses bread still warm from the oven. Eli accepted both with raised eyebrows. "Payment for the loan," she said, brushing flour from her apron. He broke off a piece of bread, his blunt fingers surprisingly graceful. Most folks just pay in coin. I'm not most folks. A slow smile spread across his face. No, he agreed. You're not. That became their rhythm, books exchanged over the counter, conversations that started with literature and spiraled into everything from frontier politics to the best way to darn a sock. Clara learned Eli had come west not for gold or land, but because a Boston publishing house had rejected his manuscript one too many times. He'd burned the pages in his mother's hearth and bought a one-way ticket to Wyoming the next morning. You don't seem the quitting type, Clara said one evening as she helped him inventory stock. Eli's hands stilled on the jar of peppercorns he was counting. Some fires need to burn themselves out. His gaze flicked to her left hand, bare of any ring. What's your excuse? The question should have stung. Instead, Clara found herself telling him about Gideon, not the polished version she gave Doc Henderson, but the ugly truth. The way the snow had felt biting through her dress as she walked back to town. The nights she'd lain awake wondering if she should have tried harder to be small. Eli listened without interruption. When she finished, he reached beneath the counter again. This time, the book he produced was bound in red leather, its title stamped in gold, Little Women. Joe March would have liked you, he said simply. The coldest night of winter found Clara curled by the Mercantile's potbelly stove, her feet tucked under her as she read aloud from Shakespeare. Eli leaned against the counter, his shirt sleeves rolled to reveal forearms dusted with dark hair, a tin cup of cider forgotten in his hand. Asterisk she speaks, yet she says nothing, asterisk Clara recited, tracing Rosalind's lines with her finger. Eli's chuckle warmed the room more than the stove. Spoken by a man who'd clearly never met you. Clara snapped the book shut, but her mock glare faltered at the look in his eyes, that same quiet intensity he'd had when she'd stitched up Tommy's braces, when she'd faced down the town council about the orphanage roof. Not desire, not pity, but something far more dangerous, respect. Outside, the wind shrieked around the eaves. Somewhere in the back room, the shop cat knocked over a jar with a muffled clink. Neither of them moved. You should write again, Clara said suddenly. Eli went still. What? The stories you burned. You should. The bell over the door jangled violently. Sheriff Pike stood framed in the doorway, snow crusting his mustache. Doc needs you both. Wagon overturned on the North Ridge, family with a baby. The moment shattered. Clara was on her feet in an instant, reaching for her medical bag. Eli already had his coat, his hand brushing the small of her back as they rushed into the storm. No more words were spoken. None were needed. But as they fought their way through the blizzard, Clara realized with sudden clarity that for the first time since stepping off that train, she wasn't walking away from something. She was running toward it. The first cough echoed through Dry Creek schoolhouse like a gunshot. Clara looked up from the ABCs she was helping little Sarah Pike trace to see Billy Henderson, Tommy's younger brother, doubled over at his desk, his face flushed an unnatural red. By sundown, 6 more children had developed fevers. Doc Henderson's kitchen became a field hospital by lamplight. Clara moved between pallets, her skirts swishing through the haze of steam from eucalyptus pots. The sharp scent of vinegar and carbolic acid clung to her hands as she wrung out cooling cloths, her fingers moving with the same precision they'd used on lace and wedding gowns back in Illinois. Diphtheria, Doc muttered as he examined Billy's throat. The boy's breathing came in ragged, wet gasps. God help us. Clara met the old man's gaze over the child's burning body. They both knew what this meant. Dry Creek had no hospital. No real doctor beyond a half-deaf army surgeon turned alcoholic. Just her, a retired veterinarian playing physician, and a mercantile owner who read too many books. She pressed a kiss to Billy's damp forehead. Fetch Eli, she told Document, tell him we need every clean linen in the store. The mercantile was dark when Clara arrived, her medical bag banging against her hip. She pounded on the door until her knuckles ached. Eli opened it shirtless, his hair sleep-tousled, a revolver dangling from one hand. The sight of his bare chest, the dusting of dark hair across firm muscle, stole Clara's breath for half a second before urgency reclaimed her. Diphtheria outbreak, she gasped. We need. He was already moving, pulling on a shirt with one hand while grabbing a crate with the other. "Take this." Alcohol, clean rags, the last of the morphine. His eyes locked onto hers. "Who's sick?" "Half the school children. It's spreading fast." Eli's jaw tightened. He reached behind the counter and produced a familiar green volume, Jane Eyre. "For the children. Stories help more than you'd think." They ran through the snow-dusted streets together, their breath puffing white in the pre-dawn dark. The next 72 hours blurred into a nightmare of sweat and screams. Clara lost count of how many throats she swabbed with silver nitrate, how many feverish brows she mopped. Eli moved tirelessly between patients, reading aloud when the children grew restless, holding down thrashing teenagers during tracheotomies. On the third night, as Clara changed the poultice on Billy's swollen neck, the door burst open. Gideon Turner stood framed in the doorway, his face ashen beneath his beard. "It's my foreman," he rasped. "Jeb's burning up." Clara didn't hesitate. "Bring him." Gideon's eyes darted to Eli, who was cradling a sobbing toddler, then back to Clara. "After what I..." "Now, Gideon." Jeb was worse than the others. The infection had settled in his lungs, turning each breath into a wet rattle. Clara worked over him long after the others had succumbed to exhaustion, her fingers cramping around the scalpel as she drained the abscess in his throat. A shadow fell across the operating table. Gideon stood there, holding out a steaming mug. "You should rest." Clara wiped her bloody hands on her apron. "He won't last the night if I do." Gideon's throat worked. "Why are you doing this?" "After I." "Because unlike you," Clara said, reaching for fresh bandages, "I don't measure a person's worth by the width of their shoulders." The words hung between them in the lamplight. Gideon stared at his boots, then turned and walked away without another word. Dawn on the fourth day brought the first signs of hope. Billy's fever broke. Then little Sarah's. One by one, the children began to sit up, weak but alive. Clara found Eli asleep in the supply closet, his long frame folded awkwardly over an empty crate, Jane Eyre still clutched in one hand. She hesitated, then reached to brush a lock of hair from his forehead. His eyes flew open, instantly alert. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other, exhausted, streaked with blood and sweat, but alive. So alive. Eli's fingers closed around hers. "We did it," he whispered. Clara squeezed back. Outside, the first birdsong of morning pierced the silence. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed. She realized with sudden clarity that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Spring came to Dry Creek like a whispered promise, first in the pale green shoots pushing through frost-softened earth, then in the riot of wildflowers painting the prairie in gold and violet. Clara knelt in the patch of dirt behind the apothecary, her fingers dark with soil as she tucked yarrow seedlings into neat rows. The sun warmed the back of her neck, and for the first time in months, she worked without her shawl, the sleeves of her dress rolled up to reveal strong forearms freckled from the sun. A shadow fell across the garden. "Those won't bloom until June, you know." Clara didn't need to look up to know it was Eli. His voice had become as familiar to her as the sound of her own breathing over these long winter months. She sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "Doc says patience is medicinal too." Eli crouched beside her, his knees popping audibly. He held out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For you." The paper crinkled as Clara unfolded it to reveal a square of fabric, deep indigo with tiny white stars, like a midnight sky frozen in cotton. "It reminded me of your eyes," Eli said, uncharacteristically hesitant. "When you're angry." Clara laughed, the sound bright in the clear air. "And how often do you study my eyes, Mr. Cartwright?" "Often enough to know they change with the weather." His fingers brushed hers as he took the fabric back. "But I was hoping you might use it for, well." He reached into his satchel and pulled out her mother's quilt, the one she'd left at his mercantile weeks ago after mending a tear. Only now, she saw new stitches forming a pattern along the border, tiny sunflowers interspersed with book-shaped patches cut from Eli's old shirts. Clara's breath caught. "I added my stories to yours," Eli said softly. His thumb traced the spine of one embroidered book. "If you'll have them." The quilt trembled in her hands. She thought of all the nights she'd spent alone in her attic room, stitching other people's dreams while hers gathered dust. Thought of Gideon's rejection, of the long walk through the snow, of every time she'd been told she was too much or not enough. Eli was still talking, his words tumbling out in an uncharacteristic rush. "I know I'm not much, just a failed writer with a mercantile and too many books." Clara silenced him the only way she could think of, by grabbing his suspenders and pulling him into a kiss. His lips were warm and slightly chapped, tasting of coffee and the peppermint sticks he kept hidden beneath the counter. For one terrifying second, he didn't respond. Then his arms came around her, the quilt crushed between them as he kissed her back with a desperation that made her knees weak. When they finally broke apart, Eli's glasses were askew, his hair standing up in every direction. Clara reached to straighten them, her fingers lingering on his cheek. "Is that a yes?" he breathed. Clara looked down at their quilt, her mother's careful stitches woven with his stories, their lives pieced together like patches in a pattern only they could see. "It's about damn time," she said, and kissed him again. The wedding took place under the old dogwood tree at the edge of town, its branches heavy with blossoms that fell like snow with every breeze. Doc Henderson gave her away. Tommy walked proudly ahead of them, his new braces, designed by Clara and forged by the blacksmith, allowing him to take his first unaided steps. Eli waited beneath the tree in his one good suit, his hands shaking as Clara approached in a dress of her own making, not white, but the deep blue of the fabric he'd given her, embroidered with golden sunflowers at the hem. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Eli leaned close, his lips brushing her ear. "I never knew peace until I met you." Clara smiled against his cheek. "And I never knew how loud peace could be." Around them, the entire town cheered, even Gideon, who'd brought a crate of oranges all the way from Cheyenne as a wedding gift. As Clara tossed her bouquet, a bundle of sunflowers and wild rosemary tied with a ribbon from Eli's favorite book, she caught sight of her reflection in the mercantile window, a tall, strong woman in a blue dress, standing beside a man who loved every inch of her exactly as she was. The sunflower had finally found its sun. The morning sun streamed through the lace curtains of the Cartwright home, painting golden patterns across the quilt draped over Clara's lap. Her hands, once so swift with a needle, now moved slowly, the knuckles swollen with age as she traced the familiar stitches. 40 springs had come and gone since she'd sewn this quilt, blending her mother's careful patterns with scraps of Eli's old shirts and that first precious square of indigo fabric he'd given her. Outside, the sounds of Dry Creek waking filtered through the open window, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, children laughing on their way to the schoolhouse she'd helped build, the distant whistle of the noon train. So much had changed. The apothecary where she'd first taken refuge now bore a shiny brass plaque, *Henderson and Cartwright Clinic. *, the mercantile had tripled in size, though it still had Eli's original bookshelf in the corner, its shelves bowed under the weight of generations of stories. The front door creaked open. "Grandma!" A whirlwind of curls and energy barreled into the room, 8-year-old Lillian, her youngest granddaughter. "You'll never guess what Papa found in the attic." The girl thrust forward a yellowed envelope. Clara's breath caught as she recognized the precise, angular handwriting she hadn't seen in decades. Gideon Turner. Her fingers trembled only slightly as she unfolded the letter inside, not one of their early correspondence, but a page dated 5 years after her wedding. "Dear Mrs. Cartwright," it began, the formal address making her lips twitch. "I write with news that may bring you satisfaction. The railroad will break ground on the new hospital next month, on the very plot where my barn once stood. They're naming it after you. Seems even a fool like me can learn, given enough time and enough examples of your kindness, *. A warm hand settled on her shoulder. Eli, his hair gone snow white but his eyes still that rich whiskey brown, leaned down to press a kiss to her temple. "Remembering?" Clara folded the letter with care. "Wondering," she corrected, reaching up to squeeze his hand. If that stubborn girl on the train could have imagined all this. Lillian tugged at her sleeve. "Tell the story again, Grandma. About how you came west with just a trunk can." In a heart full of stars, Eli finished, winking at Clara as he settled into his worn armchair. Clara drew her granddaughter onto the quilt beside her, the fabric worn soft with years of love. Outside, the sunflowers Eli planted every spring nodded in the breeze, their faces turned toward the light. "No, little one," she said, smoothing the child's wild curls. "Let me tell you about the day I realized I didn't need to be someone's second choice." And as the story unfolded, of rejection and resilience, of quiet strength and quieter love, the quilt beneath them seemed to hum with the truth Clara had lived. Some flowers don't grow in shade. Some hearts aren't meant to be small. And the best love stories aren't about fitting into someone else's dreams, but finding the person who helps you build your own. The end.